Alright, hey guys, welcome to my fourth lesson for US history. Today we'll be talking about the Great Depression and the first half of the New Deal. It is definitely going to be a big topic, so I will be splitting it up into two videos. So today it's going to be the causes of the Great Depression and the first half of the New Deal, which is pretty much FDR's first presidency. We will cover the time periods from around 1928 to 1935-ish. So yeah, let's get started then. So to kind of talk about the Great Depression first, we need to understand what really caused it and why it happened. So in the late 1920s, the economy was known as something called the bull market. The bull market classifies any stock market that is doing very well, when the stock prices have increased by a lot. The opposite of that would be called a bear market. Now, in the late 1920s, there was an increase in stock prices that lasted from 1928 to September 1929, and stocks increased by 40%, which is a substantial increase even in terms of the bull market. However, all of that ends in October 29, 1929, a very infamous day called Black Tuesday. And here we can see just that huge drop in the stock market. So the stock market crash is what most people kind of know as the immediate cause of the Great Depression. Here you can see just kind of all the chaos that ensued after the stock market crash. We had a lot of suicides and a lot of businesses going out. And this stock market crash happened mostly because people were buying on margin. Now, this means that people were only buying a small percentage of the stocks and promising to pay it back after. Now, this works great if you're able to buy the stocks and sell them back for a lot of profit. But if you're unable to sell them for a profit or the company is failing, then this becomes disastrous, as we see in the Great Depression. However, the Great Depression definitely did not happen overnight. There are definitely some long-term causes, so let's talk about those. We have prosperity based on only a few industries. So even though on the outside it looked like the economy of the US was prospering greatly, that wasn't completely true, because this prosperity wasn't distributed among many different corporations and companies. However, it was only based on a few industries. So once those industries began to fail, it was very quick for the Great Depression to happen. And we talked about this in the Progressive Era, where there was a very big unequal distribution of wealth, which means that the wage gap between the wealth and the poor was very big, and most of the wealth was only going to the top 1% of the US population. And we also have almost 50% of families living at or below minimum subsistence level. So that minimum sustenance level is kind of the marker that really shows like the minimum amount of money one might need to really survive off housing or food. Then we have credit, where farmers were deeply in debt and production outweighed demand. We talked about this in the World War I video last time, but what was happening is there was a vicious cycle that farmers would kind of put themselves into, where they would overproduce. And they'd overproduce because they needed to make more money. And because they overproduced, the demand decreased because there was so much production. And when demand decreases, then prices increase. Or prices decrease, I'm sorry. And because prices decrease, farmers are getting less money. And because farmers are getting less money, they produce more. And you can definitely see how that becomes a vicious cycle. And then we have the US putting forward high protective tariffs. We have something called the Dawes Plan, and please don't get that mixed up with the Dawes Severalty Act, which talks about something completely different. That talks about the reorganization of Native Americans in the 19th century. However, the Dawes Plan has to do with the end of World War I, where the US kind of helps Germany pay reparation loans, and the Dawes Plan actually leads to the Great Depression having a global impact outside of just the US. Now what happens is, under the Dawes Plan, the US banks agreed to loan money to Germany so that Germany can pay off their reparations to Britain and France, and then Britain and France would pay their loans back to the US. So it's kind of this circle of money that is kind of getting transferred among all of these countries, and it's working fine until the Great Depression happens, the stock market crashes, and because the US, which was a huge chunk of that money circulation, that gets eliminated, so all of that comes crashing down, and that is why the Great Depression has such a global impact outside of the country. Then we have the bank crisis. The bank crisis that follows the Great Depression is most likely the worst the bank crisis has ever been in U.S. history, and 9,000 banks closed between 1930 and 1933, and the money supply decreases by 1/3. So we will definitely see President FDR trying his best during his presidency to kind of resolve the issue of the bank crisis. So how did the American people deal with this time? So we have the industrial North, who was especially hit hard, especially Ohio, where the unemployment was 50%. That's just insane. And many Americans at the time were not really educated with how economy worked, and they did not understand that they didn't know why they were becoming unemployed. So instead of blaming it on bad economy, they thought they were becoming unemployed and being fired from their jobs simply due to lack of ability. And although at other times of crises, charities and other relief organizations would help kind of stabilize the economy, because of how bad the economy was during the Great Depression, you could see all of these people there. These organizations could not keep pace and could not support all these people. Then we have something even worse called the Dust Bowl, which is just a series of these terrible dust storms that was happening in like the Midwestern area. So here you can see the area of land from eastern Colorado to western Missouri, Texas, all the way through North Dakota. And farmers are definitely getting a bad rep during this time, because not only did they cause the Great Depression to an extent, but they also caused the Dust Bowl, because the causes of the Dust Bowl were the drought, wind, but mostly human cultivation. The farmer constantly overproducing their lands, and their ineffective cultivation methods definitely led to the Dust Bowl. Then we have John Steinbeck, who's that man over there, and he wrote The Grapes of Wrath, which quickly became one of the most famous books in America during this time. It was a story about the Dust Bowl and how people were reacting to it. It was a very relatable book for the people at the time, and I read it last year. It was very good. And Black Blizzards was another nickname for these dust storms, and you could just see how devastating they are, how scary and ominous they could be too. You could just see all the destruction that happens. And then we have this term that you should know called Okies. This is kind of a derogatory term used by people to categorize families that moved from the Dust Bowl to other areas, to Western countries, especially California. And that's kind of what the Grapes of Wrath is about. And Okies comes from the fact that a lot of these families were moving from Oklahoma, but they also just apply to anyone that fits the description of migrating westward due to the Dust Bowls and the Great Depression. Continuing on, let's see how African Americans did. They were especially hit hard. Almost 50% in the South were unemployed. And as you may imagine, segregation and discrimination was still rampant, maybe even worse. And that is exemplified in the Scottsboro case, where 9 African Americans who were later found to be completely innocent, they didn't do anything, but they were accused of rape, and an all-white jury found them guilty. Definitely some racial tensions that caused that sentencing, and 8 were sentenced to death. Now, eventually all were released from jail. However, this happened on a case-by-case basis, and the very first person to even be released happened in like the 1950s. So you can definitely see, as times become more desperate, things like segregation and discrimination unfortunately get even worse. And we have other minorities too. We have the Mexican Americans. We had around 2 million people of Mexican descent. They were mostly farmers. And a lot of people would force Mexicans out of the country because they believed that these Mexicans did not deserve to take their jobs. And we have Asians, which are still being discriminated. They it's mostly the Japanese. They fought to have laws protecting the Japanese from discrimination. We talked about this last time, how the Japanese were being segregated by San Francisco. And we also have women. There was a pressure for women to not work, especially if they were married and had a working husband. Now, this is because women were taking jobs away from other men, and they thought that they deserved to work, while the women, if they already had a husband who works, they could kind of afford to not work for that family. And although the government championed all of these relief programs later on, that they would provide relief to all the people, it really did not benefit any minorities because they were mostly targeted towards the white men. And as you may imagine, marriage and birth rates definitely declined during the Depression because the economy was so unstable and people were not financially well off. Marriage and birth rates kind of was an afterthought compared to basic physiological needs. So all of these declined during the Depression, and a huge boom was caused after the end of World War II. With the Depression, we kind of see a new expression in art. So we have Dorothea Lange, who's a photographer. She photographed Depression families. This is a very famous picture you guys might recognize of a family in Depression. And we have John Steinbeck, which we just talked about, and how he wrote Grapes of Wrath, a story about the Dust Bowl. And then we have radio, which kind of became this cultural, which definitely became important in American culture. For one thing, it was a source of entertainment for Americans, so it was kind of a way to get lost in the misery and kind of just forget about all of the suffering that they were going through. And so, yeah, they would just listen to the radio, kind of try to forget about what's going on in their lives. However, an even bigger and more impactful way the radio was used during this time was by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt through what he called fireside chats, where he would talk to Americans on a weekly basis and kind of through the radio and kind of just alleviate all the Americans that we will be fine, that we will get over it. And we also had the introduction of like soap operas, plays, and news playing on the radio as well. During this time, we also had the Spanish Civil War, which will have very big implications later on. So some Americans supported, there was pretty much two sides as any civil war, the Republican side and the fascist side. And obviously, since the Americans respect democratic values, we supported the Republican government. However, we were unable to support it as well as some other countries because of the Great Depression. And the other side, which was the fascist government of Francisco Franco, he had support of Hitler and Mussolini, who were not going through the Great Depression or like any recession on their side. So they were able to put forth all of their attention to helping out Francisco Franco. So the fascist government ends up taking over Spain. And this has huge implications later on in World War II, which we will talk about in a later video. Next, we will talk about the presidency of Herbert Hoover, who is commonly known as one of the worst presidents of our nation. And to be honest, Herbert Hoover was very unlucky. He was put into a very bad situation. However, the way he dealt with it is very controversial. Anyway, let's talk about Hoover. He urged volunteerism. If you remember from last video during World War I, Herbert Hoover was very popular because he was able to kind of get the whole country behind this volunteering phase where they kind of ration their foods for the betterment of the country. And so he thought he would be able to do that again with the Great Recession or with the Great Depression and by urging volunteerism. However, this was pretty much unsuccessful and did not work as he intended. He also feared deficit spending. Deficit spending becomes very important later on in the New Deal. We will talk more about that in the next video. However, FDR does support deficit spending, and people believe that deficit spending has led to the economy stabilizing once again. Deficit spending, if you guys don't know, is just the idea of the government spending more money than they have in hopes that the economy will stabilize once again. And Herbert Hoover, like I said, was very against it, while FDR was in support of it. So Hoover did the opposite of what you might expect, and he actually raises tariffs to the highest peacetime tariff in the nation's history through the Hawley-Smoot tariff. So he creates high protective tariffs, and this did not help the country at all, because what happened is European tariffs would reciprocate our high tariffs, and they had high tariffs as well, and this did not bode well for our crumbling economy. And we have something called Hoovervilles. You guys might have seen something like these shacks made out of, aluminum, metal, scrap metal, or cardboard boxes, and these were pretty much just shantyville houses that these families built, and they were called Hoovervilles because it was kind of like this sarcastic remark against President Hoover. They were showing their kind of contempt for Herbert Hoover by saying, look at what your policies have made us. You've made us homeless. Like, look at the houses that we're living in. And a bunch of these Hoovervilles formed, and all of them were kind of against Hoover's administration. Then we have something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and they meant to provide loans to banks, railroads, and businesses. And the idea was that if these businesses were able to kind of get money and circulate their economy, then all of that money would trickle down to the rest of society. And this was actually mostly a failure because they were never able to provide enough money to be useful. Finally, what kind of cemented President Hoover as one of the worst presidents in our nation is what happened with the World War I veterans. So the World War I veterans were promised this bonus after the war. This would be around 20 years or so after the war ended. They would receive a bonus. However, World War I veterans were hit just as hard as anyone else during the Depression, and they were struggling, they were very poor, and they did not have the money to kind of keep going. So what they wanted was they wanted their bonuses early. So what they did is they decided to march upon DC in hopes of receiving their bonuses, and they set up Hoovervilles, and Hoover wanted them gone. He knew that the government could not pay the veterans this bonus, especially when the economy was like this. So he ordered his army, led by MacArthur, who becomes a pretty big figure later on in World War II, to break up the bonus army. And the bonus army eventually leaves and taints Hoover's name as one of the worst presidents of our nation. Then that segues into the election of 1932, and we have Hoover running again in the Republican side versus FDR for the Democratic side, and you guys all know how that turns out. FDR wins in a landslide, and in a similar way to how President Theodore Roosevelt, if you remember, he kind of ran under a square deal plan. Taft ran under a dollar diplomacy. Wilson ran under New Freedom. FDR will run under something called New Deal for Americans. So he promises this New Deal for Americans. He promises that he will be the one to save the Americans from this crisis. And FDR was inaugurated on March 4th, 1933. And if you think about it, the election was held in November of 1932. So from that period, November to March, it was a pretty big delay. So FDR was actually the last person to be inaugurated on March, because starting from the next election, there would be a new amendment that would move the inauguration date to January. So let's talk about how FDR was able to bring forth his plans of the New Deal. So like we said, in March 4th, 1933, FDR was inaugurated, and he gave his very famous quote during his inauguration speech called, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So the first 100 days of any president's administration is kind of scrutinized as being the most important. This is kind of a test to see how effective they are, kind of watching their first 100 days in Congress. And FDR's is probably the most productive first 100 days any president has done, because during these 100 days, he and Congress passed a very large number of legislation. Most of FDR's legislation was split into three categories: relief, recovery, and reform. So remember those three R's. And relief is pretty much the short-term legislation it would provide relief for individuals. So if anyone was struggling, poor, or homeless, jobless, so that would provide relief for those people. Recovery was kind of more the longer term goals, help improve the economy and get America out of this recession. And finally, we have reform, which is kind of like the side job where new laws such as child labor will be put into place. And like we said a few minutes ago, he had something called fireside chats, which were these weekly radio addresses, and it assured the public it was safe to put money back in banks. And pretty much he would just tell the public that it was okay, kind of give them confidence that America was rising up again. So let's talk about banks. FDR does something very big called the bank holiday, where he pretty much just closes all the banks for days to calm Americans' fears. And this is actually very successful, one of the best things FDR was able to do. And during this time, he put forward the Emergency Banking Act. And the way the bank holiday worked was that the government would inspect all these closed banks before they could be reopened. So the government would only allow banks that were, that they knew had the funds to pay back all the people. They would only allow those banks to be opened. Then we have the 21st Amendment in 1933, where prohibition was repealed. We definitely talked a lot about this in other videos, but prohibition pretty much just means the abstaining from alcohol. So prohibition refers to the banning of alcohol, and because prohibition was repealed, alcohol became legal again. So it's kind of like a double negative. I know it's confusing, but that's the 21st Amendment. Good way to remember that is 21 is the drinking age in America. So next we will be talking about kind of a series of legislation that a lot of people nicknamed the Alphabet Soup Agency, because they are pretty much just this assortment of letters and acronyms. So first we have the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA, and this paid farmers not to grow crops to kind of counter the whole overproduction thing. So basically, in order to kind of encourage or motivate or incentivize farmers to not overproduce again, the government would pay the farmers to not grow crops. And this was actually declared unconstitutional in the later case Butler v. U.S. Then we had the National Industrial Recovery Act, created by the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA. This blue little eagle here definitely becomes a symbol later on for all the people fighting. And this specifically set minimum wages and maximum hours because they wanted to spread employment around. And by having maximum hours, what would happen is more people would be able to get a job, and it wasn't just one person working throughout all those weeks. And they definitely fought for labor unions by giving them more rights, more specifically Section 7A. And finally, they outlawed yellow dog contracts. Let's talk about yellow dog contracts, because I'm sure most of you guys don't know what that is. What they are is kind of like this agreement that business owners would give to employees. And what employees would do is, if they sign this contract, well, they'd be forced to sign the contract, and the contract says, if I take this job, I will not join a labor union. So it's kind of a way to weaken labor unions and prohibit people from joining them. And because the National Industrial Recovery Act outlawed these yellow dog contracts, it gave more power to labor unions and less influence for the business owners to kind of ban people from joining the labor unions. Then we have this very important court case called Schechter v. U.S., which declared the NRA unconstitutional because it says that legislative powers cannot be delegated to president. So what that really means is, this is going to be kind of hard to explain because I'm going to try to tell you guys how the whole U.S. government works in just a few minutes right now. But pretty much the U.S. government right now, and back then, is split into three branches. We have the legislative branch, which is Congress. We have the executive branch, which is the president. And we have the judiciary branch, which is the Supreme Court. And the reason why the branches are split is called checks and balances. It's so that one branch can't have too much power and become kind of like a monarchy. So the president is checked, and so is Congress, and so are the Supreme Courts. So all of these branches have different jobs. We have the legislative branch, whose job is to legislate new laws. And then we have the president's job, which is to enforce these laws that Congress gives them, and we have the judiciary branch, which their job is to interpret these laws to make sure that they are constitutional. But what Schechter v. U.S. Decided was that FDR was going beyond his powers as the executive branch by creating legislation, which is something that only Congress should be able to do. So that's why the NRA became unconstitutional, along with some other of his alphabet soup agencies. Then we have the PWA, or the Public Works Administration. This provided industrial recovery and unemployment relief, which was a bunch of jobs that were put into place solely with the purpose of solving this problem of unemployment. They built the Grand Coulee Dam. Then we have the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, where hydroelectric power could be a huge source of energy. And again, this just put forth more jobs. And because it was an alternate source of power, the TVA helped reform monopolies, because it would kind of distribute the industries so that just one source of energy could not take over the whole industry. And it was actually very helpful to nearby areas as well. And the cause of the Great Depression was the stock market, so surely FDR will take action to kind of stop the stock market from crashing again. So we have the Glass-Steagall Act, which set up the FDIC, which guaranteed individual banking deposits. So the FDIC stands for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and basically if you have this seal in a bank, it was kind of giving the confidence to the people that, all right, this bank is good, you could deposit your money with full safety, knowing that these banks have the capabilities to pay you back if you ever need to withdraw money. And then we have the Truth and Securities Act, which is that businesses or companies could not lie about the soundness of stocks. So what a lot of businesses would do was they were being dishonest about their stocks because they wanted more people to buy it and not sell them. So even though they knew that their company was failing, or their stocks were not doing as well as they used to be, they would lie about it and say that, oh, our stocks are fine, or our stocks are doing its best right now, to kind of sell more stocks, so they cannot do that anymore. And to kind of make sure all of these new laws were being enforced and regulated, we have the creation of the SEC, or the Securities and Exchange Commission. So they were here to regulate the stock market and kind of acted as the watchdog of the New York Stock Exchange to make sure that all of these new legislation was being enforced. And we have more work programs that kind of fit in with the alphabet soup agencies. We have the CWA, which stands for the Civil Works Administration, and they provided temporary jobs during harsh winter. So again, following the trend of all of these alphabet soup agencies, they really provide relief and provide more jobs to people. Then we have the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. If you ever see a picture like this on an exam, or like a document-based question where it's talking about the Great Depression and the New Deal, where they are working outdoors, it is always a safe bet to talk about the CCC, as it refers to government camps for young men, reforestation, and firefighting. And so it pretty much just deals with any outdoor work. Alright, so that's going to be it for today's lesson. Thank you guys for watching. Like I said, we are going to be splitting up the New Deal into two parts, so we will definitely be talking more about that next time, with kind of like the end of FDR's presidency. But anyway, if you guys learned anything, subscribe to the channel, press the like button, please spread the word. And if you have any questions or comments, you could either leave it on the video right now, or you could privately message me if you missed the live stream. So anyway, yep, that's going to be it. Thank you guys for watching, and